anybody who couldn't make it tonight is able to review later. So thanks for noticing that, Meredith. I'm gonna share my screen again. So as I was saying, I wanted to review the MVP action grant. So again, we're in the planning grant, but the eligible project types for action grants, so that as we move into developing strategies for the environment sector tonight, we can be keeping these on the top of our mind when we think of the strategy, you know, the strategies that come to the top of your mind based off of the features that we're going to discover. We can be thinking of these eligible project types as a way to shape what we write down in the matrix to make it a very competitive, strategy versus a non-competitive strategy. So the eligible project types for the MVP action grants are planning projects, which include assessments, capacity buildings, regulatory updates. So that's like, you know, PVPC has been doing a lot of that under MVP action grants, where we help communities review their existing zoning or subdivision regulations, et cetera, to make sure that nature-based solutions, low impact development, green infrastructure are encouraged through development. Design and permitting. So that's the design end of construction project that you can then apply for in the next MVP action grant rounds to do the actual construction and on the ground implementation. Or you might already have the design ready to go for something, and then you could jump right ahead into applying for construction monies. Projects that are not MVP competitive are largely those for which there already exists funding sources via the state or federal government, dedicated funding sources. So, and or those that are not seen as being particularly responsive to climate change. So tree removal is one that we, in the early rounds of MVP, we saw a lot of action grants writing, you know, getting help for removing hazard trees that are coming down on telephone wires or electrical wires, you know, or that are threatening municipal buildings or residences. MVP will not pay for tree removal, but they will pay for things like tree planting. So you can figure out, you know, how to use maybe DCR funds to pay for tree removal, and then MVP to support the tree planting side of whatever program you might have. Anything that so this is FEMA hazard mitigation plans, but FEMA also has dedicated funding for a lot of that mitigation type planning and implementation style projects. So MVP is not interested in funding those. And then, you know, these, the following ones here are basically, those are not eligible because they don't show that the town is taking climate projections seriously and or is being responsive to climate projections. So MVP wants to fund communities that are showing that they want to change business as usual, change the way that they've been doing things to make sure that they don't repeat past mistakes, that they move forward, and things that are built in the future, private development, public development, et cetera, are always going to be taking into account resiliency and climate projections.
I do want to point out, however, that although they don't support the feasibility or design of solar or battery systems, they do support installation. And I believe, or my understanding is, that they were trying to avoid companies coming in from outside of your town, utilizing or encouraging you to utilize funding to propose projects. But if your town finds that that's an area that is really in support of their preparedness or their future success, and the town does a design or hires someone and really wants that to take place, then they will indeed support your installation, so long as it's also taking into account other areas of being climate ready. So for instance, some towns have put in solar arrays 4 feet higher so they can put a pollinator garden underneath the arrays. And that shows a concept design that's sort of a whole habitat equation. So that's an important note there.
Yes, and thanks, Meredith. The installation of solar systems, that's not something that I haven't seen. It's not that it hasn't existed. I'm just saying I personally haven't read about those projects via MVP. So I myself, and I don't know if you could, Patty, I couldn't offer, if that's something that Chester, wants to talk about tonight. It's not something that I could really offer any perspective on right now. I do know that a lot of times, as the years have gone on and the MVP program is now in its fourth or fifth year, the third or fourth year, I think that they're awarding MVP action grants, but fourth or fifth year that the program has been going on. They are learning more and more about what they do want to fund and what they don't want to fund. And there's a lot of things that are still case by case basis. Like if you can make a very good, compelling argument for it, it might be more competitive than somebody else asking for the same thing, but they didn't make the best case for it.
Yeah, we don't have Carrie Ann on the line tonight, do we?
No, I
haven't
didn't.
seen her. Yeah.
Well, we didn't when we went through before, but I was thinking that too. But if she comes in our next workshop, and that's a question, that we want to pose to her, I'm sure she'd be able to speak more intelligently to that. And also, so for anybody who doesn't know, Carrie Ann Petrick is the regional MVP coordinator for the region, the MVP region that Chester falls into, which I think is called the Hill Towns and Berkshire region. It's split up differently than by county. So she's also always available just to sort of call or email to ask questions like that as well. So you will not be in the dark when it comes time to write an MVP action grant. All right, for some reason it's not progressing. There we go. So that last slide was very high level. It didn't give a lot of great examples of what makes a strategy competitive. I really want to emphasize this slide tonight. It was in this presentation last week, but there were so many slides. We had to get through so much stuff last week that I don't know if it was lost, and I feel like we could use a reminder on this. This is something that we always need to keep emphasizing with MVP, because this is the change to business as usual. So it's not the way that most people, myself included, are used to thinking about planning solutions. And it's really what MVP wants to fund. So here we're talking about nature-based solutions. And the definition of nature-based solutions is a little bit cumbersome. It's the sustainable management and use of nature for tackling challenges such as climate change, water, food security, biodiversity protection, human health, and disaster risk management. So I think a very easy way to think about this, and maybe one that we're more used to, is thinking about a nature-based solution for something like stormwater, flooding, green infrastructure, or low aspects of low impact development are nature-based solutions for stormwater flooding, in that they set up systems that mimic natural hydrology. So removing impervious pavement or never laying down impervious surfaces to begin with, so that rainwater is allowed to be managed where it falls, either by infiltration into the ground, just naturally, as would happen on in a forest or in a field, or by sending stormwater through a series of vegetated systems before it enters into the gray stormwater system, the pipes that exist underground. Those are examples of nature-based solutions that, in the planning world at least, I think we're more familiar with working around. Sometimes there's some features that we come up with in MVP, which I'm sure we'll have some tonight, where it's just really difficult to think, how do we come up with a nature-based solution to solve the fact that I lose power at my house every time it's really windy. And it's been so windy this year. Like we can't stop the wind, and that's the electrical system. So what's the nature-based solution there? That it's worth spending some time brainstorming around those topics, because if we come up with strategies that are not nature-based, they are not going to be as competitive than if they are nature-based. And so therefore they're less likely to be funded in full or at all by MVP. And really that's the purpose here right now, is for us to be able to start implementing the strategies that we come up with in Chester. So These
Corinne,
slides,
can I jump
sure.
in? I'm sorry, my microphone is really glitchy, like turning it on and off. It takes a minute or two to respond. I just wanted to build on sort of that idea of nature-based solution and what Markel put in the chat. She mentions an example of a revised solar bylaw that takes into account wildlife habitat considerations in Williamsburg, and they did a lot of research on that. And one thing I know about Williamsburg and the problems that they were having and other communities were having with solar project permitting is the stormwater runoff coming from a lot of those sites. And so I imagine that Williamsburg also, you know, in that by also included some stormwater management considerations, especially with the frequency of the larger storms that we're seeing. It's more and more important. And so that's a really important sort of nature-based solution that's adaptation to climate change.
That's great, Patty. And obviously that ties directly into what Meredith was just saying. You know, it's like a great example of how MVP can fund working on solar. In that case, like I would say solar planning, even though they said they won't fund solar plan. It's not the planning of a specific installation, but it's a regulatory review around solar. And it's also an example of how Williamsburg in that case was committed to changing business as usual. So they wanted to take a good look at their, I'm not familiar with the project, but just, you know, hearing this, they wanted to take a look at their bylaw and regulations around solar to make sure that they're not only fixing the problems that exist with specific sites moving forward, but that they ensure that those mistakes can't be made again. So while it's maybe not as exciting as an on the ground project to some people, it's a really important step to show to MVP, EEA, that the community is serious about this. But also it shows to your, I mean, it's also showing that the community is serious about this and you don't want to end up having to continually pay for these mistakes in the future. So that's a great example. The next 3 slides are other examples of recently awarded MVP action grants that use nature-based solutions to mitigate specific concerns within communities. And these were taken from the MVP website. I don't have more information than what's on the slide, so we don't know the specifics really of the projects, but it's sort of, these 3 slides give you they sort of give a scope of the types of nature-based solutions that are being awarded out there. So in this particular one, this was from the Southeast region, the Southeast MVP region in Massachusetts. And what it was is a watershed management and climate action plan for the Assawamsett Ponds complex. And so you can see from the map there, they did some either preliminary mapping or mapping as part of the action plan to determine or to demonstrate where flooding was currently happening. And then you can see that in the priorities description, it says the development of a plan to cope with floodwater issues, address water supply and water quality, and improve social resilience. So it's a very broad, like the priorities were pretty broad there, but what they didn't say was we're having flooding issues, so we're just going to enlarge the culvert, you know, in this one area, or we're going to dredge the pond. You know, I'm not familiar with this area, but like dredge the pond or something like that just to make it be able to hold more water. They said we might be doing those things, but we're also going to also do a comprehensive plan so we know, we can make sure we really understand what the problems are and what all the opportunities are to fix it. And at the same time, we're going to talk about the effect of these problems and the potential solutions on our social resilience. So it has a multifaceted scope there. Okay, this next one is from Great Barrington, and it was a climate action resilience and equity plan. So again, another plan. And this is interesting because with the social, that's one of the ones where it's kind of hard to think of nature-based solutions sometimes. And here's an example of how this isn't necessarily a nature-based solution, but it's a unique project that MVP wanted to fund. So Great Barrington developed a plan to specifically reach out to their underrepresented and marginalized populations to get them involved with adaptation plans. So they identified the groups that usually don't have a seat at the table, and the whole purpose of this was to start relationship building with those communities. And then lastly, the Kunamesut River Restoration Project, also in the southeast. So this was construction and on-the-ground implementation, and it was a restoration of a wetland to reestablish floodplain connectivity and the improvement of fisheries. So this is one where we're starting to see these bigger projects, I think. Patty, I don't know if you would agree with that, but we're starting to see these bigger projects that are through MVP action grants that are focused on watershed scale planning, where you know, there might be some problems identified within a specific municipality or town, but then those communities are able to look further upstream to, you know, if they're very urbanized communities or something, and there's not a lot of space for them to be able to develop nature-based solutions within their own communities, they are able to start working with their neighboring communities or communities in the watershed and look upstream and identify beneficial sites to improve flood storage or reconnect existing wetlands, et cetera, that have a trickle effect, so to speak, all the way downstream. So it has these regional benefits rather than just focusing on one community. So those, we're starting to see more of those, and they're very, I think, exciting for MVP.
You'll also see there that MVP is one piece of the project. So there are lots of different funding sources that had an interest in seeing this rejuvenation, and they really specified what the MVP funding or action grant was best in line with and used it for that part of their project.
For sure. Yeah, that's a great point. If you can align grant periods and funding sources, you know, to, you know, in some cases meet each other's match, maybe match requirements, but definitely in other cases amplify the value that you get just by virtue of having more funds. You know, that always makes the project more powerful. This is just a screenshot again of that grant viewer that I was speaking about. So if you can follow the link in the chat if that's something you're interested in looking at. Planning grants and MVP action grants are located on here. Okay, so then moving into what we're going to be doing today. Here's the risk matrix again. Those of you who were here last week are familiar with this, but I'm going to give you a little bit of an anatomy lesson for it right now. So for those who were not here last week, Meredith worked hard with the community and also verified via existing plans that there are 4 high priorities of, there's more than 4, but that there's 4 climate hazards that stand out as being repeatedly of concern in Chester. These were identified in, you know, plans such as the hazard mitigation plan, the open space and recreation plan, and then repeatedly sort of verified through Meredith's outreach conversations with stakeholders in town. So can you see my cursor or not? Okay, well, there's 4 columns that are under top priority hazards above the blue text that says climate hazards. And so each column is associated with one of those 4 hazards. In Chester, it's wind, extreme temperatures, flooding due to stormwater flooding, and I'm blanking on the 4th one right now. Maybe winter temperature, but we'll see it when we go down to the next slide. So those are the 4 columns here. And all the way on the left side, there's a column for us to write down the features that we identify in Chester. So those are the features and assets, and those will be things like open space generally, or like a specific wildlife management area. You can get very specific, or you can be very general. It can be concepts, or it can be like actual items or locations. And then the 3rd pink box you see here is strategies. And so that's where we start to identify, we start to write down ideas on how to protect the assets that we identify and shore up the vulnerabilities that we identify, all with the idea that we're shoring them up against the 4 climate hazards that are listed at the top. So that'll be more clear as we start to actually look at the matrix. Here are some examples of features for the environment section, which again is what we were working on today. These are not everything that we'll be talking about, but these are some examples of what came from our research into Chester's existing plans and Meredith's conversations with you all. So things like open space and recreation areas, again, in and of itself, that could be a feature, just open space, but you could also say, I want to talk about a specific open space area. I want to talk about this park, or I want to talk about this wildlife management area. And that could be a feature as well too. Trees and forests, wildlife, wetlands, local agriculture, invasive species and pests. And by pests, we mean, well, we can mean many things, but often we mean the mosquitoes and ticks and things like that that are slowly moving or maybe rapidly moving into locations that they haven't previously been found that might cause vector-borne diseases. And groundwater and surface water quality and quantity are also examples of environmental features. So examples of strategies that might go along with those features include, and again, these are not things that you have to agree with right now. They're just examples of how we might talk about these. Include land acquisition to permanently protect climate vulnerable resources. So that could have to do with the open space, or it could have to do with drinking water resources. River and shoreline restoration. Watershed and water supply vulnerability and risk assessment. We talked a little bit about that in our infrastructure meeting. Conduct field studies and model to evaluate how to best accommodate floodwaters, et cetera. We know that flooding is a big problem in Chester, so that's something that we didn't talk about that strategy in our infrastructure conversation last week, but we did talk about flooding. Again, a lot of these features and strategies are going to cut across all 3 or multiple ones of these different sectors that we have, the social, environment, and infrastructure. And then lastly, permitting and design for ecological restoration and habitat management to increase resilience. Okay, so that's the last slide for tonight. Because more time tonight talking about nature-based solutions, and after our workshop last week, as I was going through the strategies that we collected for infrastructure, I realized that there were a lot of great ideas in there. I don't want to discount what we wrote down at all. But there was a lack of nature-based solutions. And because it's important in order to be funded for any of these strategies that they have at least a component of the nature-based aspect, I wanted to give us some time at the very beginning of this workshop today to just review what we wrote last week and see if we can come up with anything nature-based to either add on to the strategies that already exist, or maybe come up with some new strategies that we didn't think about last time. So I'm going to stop share. And
so Corinne, 15 minutes on this. Do you want me to keep an eye on the time? Is that helpful?
Yeah, if we could go so it's 6:47 right now. If we could, let's try 10 minutes at first. And I mean, 15 minutes if the conversation is really great. But yeah, it would be great to start. It would be great to start on the environment by 7-ish. Okay. So I'm going to now I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to, okay. Oops. I hate this. The Zoom thing gets in the way and I can't see my tabs here. Okay, all right. So here we are in the matrix again. I'm going to go back over the infrastructure tab. So what I did to prepare for this is I've just, I went through on my own, well, in consultation with Meredith and Patty, and I highlighted in green two strategies that I think did a great job of coming up with nature-based solutions. So we can look at them as examples. And then I highlighted in yellow some features that I thought had the opportunity for nature-based solutions if we, thought and had conversations about it, but which didn't currently include any nature-based solutions. So before we jump into this, are there any questions about that, or should we just go right in?
Let's go.
All right, great. So I'll give the first two examples first. So the municipal water system, the strategy that I thought was like a great example of nature-based solution here was implement the proposed water supply protection district to regulate land use activities and set performance standards for activities on privately owned land within the watersheds and other actions from the Chester Source Water Protection Plan. So really this strategy is just saying follow through with this other plan we already did, but the land use study and then working with people to sort of change the land use or land maintenance as needed, that's a real nature-based solution, even though it seems kind of not that innovative. You're working with what's actually going on with the land and changing business as usual. So that's one example. And then the second example was with the Horn Pond Reservoir. And the strategy that came out of that was conduct an assessment of current land use and management on the approximately 17 properties surrounding Horn Pond, whether the land use impacts the water quality and if there's a need for change of use or engagement around land management to protect water quality. So that's very similar to the previous one in that it's an assessment for water quality purposes of current land use practices, but it's showing a willingness to learn from and change how things are currently being implemented if it's not working for water quality. And then this one has the great aspect of engagement around land management. So it includes that sort of public engagement piece as well. Okay, and so then there's 4 that I highlighted in yellow that I thought we could work on. So because we probably now have 10 minutes, maybe we could try and spend around 2 with each one. And if nothing's coming, we can just move on to the next one. And if we're having a really great conversation around one of them, then we can spend more time with that one. But so the first one was bridges. Noted that sedimentation is the problem here that we're talking about. We specifically noted Main Street. There's 3 bridges there. It's a vulnerability because of the sedimentation. There was no actual strategy that came out of the workshop. The second is a railroad. So the strategy that came out of there is set up a partnership with CSX and other towns to prevent brush fires. There's been some conversation around that. That in and of itself it could or could not be a nature-based solution depending on how you decide to implement it. Meredith brought up the really great point that the railroad has effectively cut off one side of the river from itself. So it's losing a lot of storage capacity and resilience on that end. Routes 20. This is one where we talked a lot about evacuation plans, but maybe there's an opportunity to do another watershed assessment plan like we looked at on those example slides from other communities to locate storage opportunities or to model and see what we can expect to be coming in terms of floodwaters in the future. And then lastly was the Abbott Brook Culvert, which is also around the Taft Hill Road, both are identified in the same one. Again, a lot of conversation around evacuations and perhaps creating new trails and things like that, but maybe there's some nature-based solution around the culvert that can help alleviate the problems that's happening to begin with instead of just reacting to the problem that's there. So does anybody have any ideas about any of these?
Corinne?
No.
Corinne?
Yes, Bob.
Good, thank you. Could I just back up to Horn Pond Source Water Protection? Just quickly. Following up on the conversation that we had last week, I had a chance to do a little bit of research on some of the abutting property deeds and learned that at least some of them have been converted to timeshare.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if that's an additional concern or not, but I just wanted to share that with everybody. Thank you.
I think it's also really important in the discussion of any kind of bylaw review to acknowledge that this land lies within the town of Beckett.
Mm-hmm.
So it would need to be a bylaw review and implementation within both towns.
Right. I'm going to write here, work with Beckett.
That makes sense. Chester's connection, of course, is the water rights.
I would love to add something to the bridge. Sometimes I think it's in the framing of how one looks at the design and the approach to redesign, making sure that the value to the environment around the bridge is assessed in equal measure with the needs of transport. So that the bridge blocks passage of both water and sediment, as well as debris, affects the upstream and also restricts the access to a very large area that Chester has for flood storage just to the east or downstream of Main Street.
I would second what Meredith just said. A study of management of the river under the bridges, I think, is key. If we had a terrific flood on those rivers and it compromised the Main Street Bridge, it would really hurt the access of people to get to safety. But folding in the idea of environmental impact and perhaps redesigning it with nature-based solutions, I think is a terrific idea.
I think it also gives you an opportunity to add in some historic features that in an emergency would not be top of the list. And because Chester has a lot of its history and transportation and some amazing features, that holding on to that cultural value in the design of the bridge could also be a really positive selling point or encouragement. And then you end up with something that's both a cultural and historical, as well as an environmentally friendly bridge. I think the other thing that Chester might consider is it a travesty that it only has a one lane at a time across the bridge?
But you're talking about the Maple Street Bridge. I was talking about the Main Street Bridge.
No, I'm talking about Main Street. Right now, you're operating with a one-way passage, which also, if you were going to continue doing one lane across the bridge and a beautiful walkway, then you could do perhaps a span, or it wouldn't need to carry the weight that it does require when you have a two-lane bridge. So that's just something to consider.
Okay, that sounds good.
I have a question about the nature of sedimentation at the bridge. You know, I know in some communities, I've seen a lot of wash from dirt roads, and the roads are re-graveled every year. And then there's like, you end up having these deltas of gravel in the rivers. I'm wondering if, if you look upstream and think about what's bringing that sediment down, if there's anything that could be addressed along those lines.
I think that's
I can add to that. So stuff like that can.
Oh, you're muted. Leanna, you're muted.
Sorry, dang it. There we go. So some of that stuff can be addressed with by the Division of Ecological Restoration. So they can help towns and municipalities try to make the crossings more efficient. So for the infrastructure, for town safety, for the resource. So by way of like talking to a fluvial geomorphologist who can look at the way the river is, how it's flowing, what the infrastructure is there at the time, and why it's blocking up or it's not passing water sediment like it should be, so they can come up with a new design plan to make it more efficient, as well as to be able to provide that safety for the town for people to get out. So that's definitely something that can be brought up through DER. And there's and I can also add to the Abbott Brook culvert as well through that. So, but we'll move to the next. I'll wait till that we get to that.
It's 6:58. So what I was going to say is that I feel like this one is related also to the Route 20 problems. Like, so we mostly talked about flooding on the Route 20 problems. Somebody correct me if you disagree, but because of that, I think it would be, I personally think it would be efficient to move to the culvert one right now, because I think that's the other sort of low hanging fruit to think of nature-based solutions.
Right. So nature-based solutions for that one would be through DER again. They right now have a culvert replacement grant that's going on. I know the town of Middlefield is looking to replace some culverts and to tap into that grant. So there are grants available through the state to replace culverts if towns apply for them. And after looking at layers for culvert assessments on Abbott Brook, so that barrier is considered a severe barrier. So it could be a good candidate for replacement and possibly for that grant.
And when you say it's a severe barrier, the upgrade to the grant then would be to, part of the interest for DER would be to remove the wildlife passage barrier. So it would be upgrading to some sort of standards along those lines.
Yes, it would be for wildlife passage as well for hydraulic passage. Because if it's undersized and it's going to be blocking, it's going to create that washout, the flooding and everything else. So it would be replacing it with something either in kind or something that's more optimal based on the hydrology.
So it sounds like perhaps the municipal vulnerability planning could be the design and preparation of a grant for DER. And that could be something very valuable to then be able to submit for DER funds next year.
Absolutely.
Patty, can you speak to that? I don't know. I'm wondering if EEA, I have not seen anything like that where there's been an application to EEA to fund time to apply for another grant.
I think what Meredith was suggesting is that the MVP grant could sort of tackle the first piece.
Oh, would fund the actual design.
Design
okay,
and permitting,
right.
and then it would tee it up for the culvert grant for implementation.
Okay.
With an emphasis on fish passage and access to a very unobstructed watershed area around Abbott Brook.
Okay. So it's 7 o'clock now. Does anybody have anything they want to add to either the one that I just unhighlighted, the culvert, or any of these other three?
But Corinne, just to revisit Andy's concern about the Main Street Bridge.
Okay.
And what I call the island underneath it. I think that goes back to the original bridge was really two spans, and the center of it was on that island in the middle. And of course, over many decades, that island is built up with sediment and rocks and trees, and has put us at risk for high water concerns. So just wanted to throw that out. Thank you.
So would there be an associated strategy there, Bob, of doing some management around that center island, or?
I'm wondering if, what state agency would approve perhaps mitigating that island. I have no idea. Is there a way that it could be reduced, removed? I don't know.
Because the bridge is compromised at this point, is my understanding. I believe that it needs a full redesign, but I think what you're saying is really important to make sure that rolled into any design is a look at what the forces the river is acting on that structure in a more comprehensive manner.
Okay.
I wasn't aware that the current bridge is that compromised. That's concerning.
Yeah, with what Meredith was saying, that makes sense. They can have, because it's a recurring problem, hiring a consultant to do the analysis on it would be the best route if the town's able to get funding for it.
Okay, so it sounds like this should be an addendum to that first strategy then, which is the redesign strategy. So I'm gonna insert, and these are not gonna be perfectly worded right now. I go back and make them nicer, but consider the effects this bridge will have. Okay, so conduct an environmental review of best management and maintenance around all three bridges. And so let's say consider the effects of habitat and environmental conditions. So I'm just going to say including problematic island. Okay.
I have a quick question about those bridges. So those are town bridges, they're not maintained by Mass DOT at all? Does anyone know?
No, those, it's Kathy. Those bridges are not maintained by DOT. They're
Okay.
maintained by the town.
Okay. DOT does have some stuff that's going on for rivers and roads and looking at the hydrology as well as design. So I can they do have some websites and some stuff that's going on for that. So that could also be another source for some information, is just consulting with DOT.
I'm just writing consult with DOT to make sure the town can take advantage of all relevant programming and grants. Okay, great.
Yeah, Corinne, one thing that Meredith put forward was that there needs to be a written request to Division of Ecological Restoration for them to assess the Main Street Bridge. So I don't know if you want
Okay.
to slip that in there.
Yeah,
I have
so
it in my notes, so.
Work with DER to make, so I'm going to change work with DER to submit written request to DER.
Yeah,
Does that
submit,
make
yeah.
sense? Okay.
Leanda, does that, that's the way to do it? And
Yeah,
Meredith, yeah,
Yeah, I believe so.
okay.
I know that that's true for dam removals or for an assessments are available on certain projects, but I'm not
Yeah.
sure what the parameters are.
Yeah,
Okay, so then let's move into environment so we don't feel like we need to come back to environment on our third workshop. So once again, and for those who are not here for the first meeting, there's been a little bit of pre-population of this matrix in that, you know, all of these things are up for discussion or amending, but these came, the features that are all the way in column A, those are features, both vulnerabilities and strengths. You can see what they're listed for in the B or S column. Some of them are both. That came out of Meredith's conversations with you all. And that also came from existing plans like the hazard mitigation plan or open space and recreation plan. And the strategies that are associated with those came from the same sources. So we either moved them from other plans over. And so in some cases, they may not be nature-based solution if they came from the hazard mitigation plan. And other times they seem to have come from Meredith's conversations with specific individuals or groups of individuals. So if there's any questions about what something means or where it came from, we can figure that out. They're in blue right now just to differentiate them from what I'm about to write. So I think what I'll do is I'll just walk through the environmental features one by one and not spend a lot of time on them, not describe them, just read what's there so that we can have a sense. We'll spend maybe a few minutes thinking if anybody can come up with another environmental feature that hasn't already been stated, if there's anything anyone wants to talk about that is not already indicated. And then we can move specifically into strategies once we all have a good understanding of what features we're going to be talking about. Okay, so the first one here is wildlife management areas, which include all of these in the next column over. That seems like an extensive list of what's in Chester. All right, so we can talk about strategies for this, could be either general or they could be related to specific ones. That's up to you. Open space, this is a general feature. We're talking about any forest, park, and recreation, but if you have a strategy for one specific open space area, you're also welcome to talk about that, and we can indicate that. Agriculture, generally, that's probably meaning agriculture both as like quote unquote industry or economic piece in town, but also the agricultural lands, you know, that are associated with that as a natural resource. Wetlands and vernal pools, water bodies, specifically reservoirs in this one, and then water bodies, rivers below that. I'm assuming ponds would go either with reservoirs or well, reservoirs is probably just straight drinking water. So maybe ponds would be in wetlands, but we can add ponds if anybody wants to talk about ponds specifically. These don't have to stay as specific as they are, or we can make them more specific. Invasive species generally. Vector-borne diseases. Again, we're talking about ticks carrying diseases like Lyme, but there's other diseases as well, as I'm sure you're all aware, and mosquitoes carrying triple E. And then the last one we have here is the impacts of development, such as from residential development, commercial development, infrastructural development, including cell towers, windmills, solar arrays, etc. So this is a conceptual feature, right? It's the impacts of development, and we can get specific or less specific with that. Does it make sense? How did people feel about how this went to last time? Does it make sense to go through these kind of in an organized way? And if anybody has anything to say, they can. And if not, we'll move on. Or do we want to just open up the conversation now? Which is what I think we did last time. It was more sort of went with the conversation rather than flow through the matrix.
I was hoping we could have an expanded discussion of both solar and wind topics.
Okay, so start with, so, and do you envision that aligning with the impacts of development feature, or creating those as their own features?
I would defer to some of the more qualified people that are on this forum who have investigated and researched and studied both of those fields. The only thing that I would throw in, Corinne, is that we have, in my opinion, an underutilized asset and a major plus to the town of Chester in the form of our own Chester Municipal Electric Light Department.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that some smarter minds than mine could make that work to our benefit somehow through solar and or perhaps wind power. So I'm hoping that some of the better minds on that topic will jump in and pick up the ball.
Okay, so I'm just gonna say really quickly that I created that as its own feature in order to differentiate it from the impacts of development, so that those cells don't become too clustered, if that makes sense. They stay readable. So with that, I will open it back up again.
I'd say the concept of Chester looking into that is to create its own power. Right now, we're dependent on sourcing power from other places, and we're sort of at the bottom of the list because we're very small. But if we were able to generate our own power, we'd of course have the resiliency of being able to sustain ourselves with climate impact. And I think the first step that's needed is somehow figure out how we could do a study that combines not only solar and wind, but battery technology, so that we could be sustainable. And I like Meredith's idea of incorporating how we could have an environmental impact as well of the design for wildlife or vegetation or whatever it happens to be. But again, it's a green thing, and what it does is it combats climate change by being a more green community. To me, if we had our entire community as a green community, we'd be setting an amazing example for the state. But the first step is trying to find the funds for a study of that, which may be outside the scope of this program.
Okay, can you all read what I'm writing? Or should I be reading that to you? So I'll just read it to you. I translated.
It could be a little bit larger, the font. I don't know if you can do that. That would allow us to read.
Yeah,
it
I can zoom in. I always automatically zoom out so that I can see more at a time, but I realize that makes it really small. So is that better? Or okay. So what I have here, or what I translated from you, Andy, is conduct a feasibility study of generating renewable power with battery technology to increase local energy resilience, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and include an environmental impact study to ensure that increased development of renewable, what do you call those? Is that like a plant? Is renewable energy structures?
You could say structure.
Okay.
I would call them installations.
Installation, that's great. Okay. Study to ensure that increased development of renewable energy installations do not have a destructive.
No, I would say to construct it to have a positive impact on
Okay,
environment.
all right, great. Okay, so have a net positive impact on local ecology.
I would also include somewhere that it would be a feature of the Chester Electric Company. So that, you know, it's a town-wide benefit
Right, okay.
of being a green community. And it's not outsourcing to another company, just coming in, putting in solar that we could get tax revenues from. This is actually creating our own energy to be self-sufficient, resilient, as well as a positive impact on the environment, and contributing to reducing carbon emissions.
Is that, I'm sorry, what is the municipal utility called? Chester, is it Chester Light and Electric?
Chester Municipal Light Company.
Okay,
If I can get over, if I find a safe place.
all right. Generating.
I think there's also a nice tie-in between the increased perhaps pollinator garden and facilitating the farming.
Mm-hmm. Do we want to make that more specific within this strategy? I also think that that's something that could span both of these, where you would want to ensure that there's a lot already here about amending, like doing a regulatory review, basically, to make sure that all of the code sets these structures up to be as ecologically healthy as possible. So do we want to call pollinators out specifically, or do you feel like leaving it more general is okay?
I think general is okay. Also on the Chester Municipal, it's Electric Light Company. There's electric in, yeah.
I knew there was an electric in there somewhere.
Right.
Great.
And in that part, I would also encourage looking into hydro. This town built itself on hydropower. It was old, turn mills, but there's as I understand it, the town draws its water from a reservoir that's uphill a considerable distance. And so that comes down in pipes. And Portland, Oregon had the same situation, and they put electrical generators in line in their pipes and made electricity while they drew water. So things like that are already known about.
Chris, you're exactly right. Horn Pond, our current source water, is at 1,200 feet and flows downhill to the treatment plant, underground pipe. You're right.
Yep.
Great.
Wait till you get a real opening.
Okay. And
Just, I just say, just be specific on the hydropower so that it's not going to be confused as being on like the West Branch or the Middle Branch.
Drop in grade. I'm sorry, it's pipes to not the wastewater treatment plant, it's pipes to the
Water treatment facility
Yeah.
at Austin Brook Reservoir.
That's a good point.
That's the terminus of the pipe from Horn Pond.
Okay, great.
I think the renewable energy is really exciting. And I think, in terms of like, there is an issue with forest clearing that can happen for some solar installations. And I think it's captured in there, but to do it in a way that, really values the local ecology and the value of the forests, which really do protect the waterways, especially the West Branch of the Westfield and Chester.
Existing open space that's not being utilized. There's the gravel land that's right on the side of Route 20 there.
So,
Yeah, that's a great point. Like already cleared areas would be prioritized, which is part of, I think, some of these solar bylaws that are being revised, is really to make, there's a lot of open cleared land in some places that could be utilized before sort of going to clearing the forest.
And part of this could be land acquisition, identifying the most favorable spot and then allowing some grant funds to be able to do some land acquisition.
Another way to do it now is floating your solar collectors on bodies of water. Cuts down on evaporation now that temperatures are getting higher. That's been a problem with a lot of water sources.
We do have the great, biomap 2 really maps some of that most important forest core habitat. So we have, at our fingertips, data that show sort of the most important forests. So that's helpful when thinking through, I think, like where maybe not to cite some of this.
This is Rich Holzman. Can you hear me?
yes.
Oh, good. Finally got in here. I'm in the car now and we're going home. I'm sorry to interrupt like this, but a few moments ago, somebody mentioned about, well, we're talking about how we do renewable energies, but I think we need to emphasize scenic sustainability as well, because we don't want to end up with renewable energy sources that defile the scenic beauty of the area. That's critically important because that will affect who comes, how they settle, and so on. I think we can't diminish the importance of that. The scenic sustainability.
Yeah, okay. I've not heard that term before, but I really like it. Scenic sustainability. It's nice and alliterative. Ensure scenic sustainability.
Are you bringing birthday cake home with you?
No, just birthday cookies.
Okay.
I want to just throw this in there. Back in 2014, our agency did a lands for priority protection and lands for priority development. It might be something to look at in this process somewhere to see if those make sense. And I think, looking at that biomap 2, there's more climate change information that I think needs to be considered on those maps. But I just want to put that out there, that they exist.
Yeah, they're currently working on a new biomap. So biomap 3 will be coming out, I believe, in 2022 is what they're hoping for.
Yeah, and we actually we're updating our open space and recreation plan in the town of Williamsburg, and have put together some climate resilience maps using the Nature Conservancy's data that show, and you can really zoom in to the parcel level to see how resilient climate change some of these places are, which is really helpful. And just generally, Chester and all of Western Massachusetts is a really critical link in the Northern Appalachians. It really connects, and it's a really important and critical wildlife corridor. So, and you can see it's bright green on the maps. So, but yeah, we are using those climate resilience maps in our open space plan.
And that's a good point as to how valuable these natural forests are that we have. We have so much open space protected in Chester, but it's valued so low for the state pilot program. It's just very unfortunate.
Yep.
Yeah, I think there's a new, I know Senator Hines is trying to tackle the pilot issue since the state came out saying that Western Mass really, the towns here are really disadvantaged in terms of pilot payments. So that is certainly a very valid concern that's undervalued.
Yeah, it's a high priority for us.
Okay, so this row 15 here with impacts of development from solar, but also from other types of, development. This is really turning into sort of the strategy looks very long right now. I think it's good to include all of these things because it shows that you're thinking about all of them. You can always add to it later, but it's really turning into a robust regulatory review, which we know MVP likes to fund and are really important for all the reasons that we've already spoke about. So that this is a really great one here, I think. If there,
you see some wording in there, and maybe the others on this call can come up with something to remember that the outreach and education piece is really highly valued through all of the action grant reviews. So whether it's important that it's somewhere embedded in your plan, your desire to bring this information to your students and community in a way that allows for an easy adoption of these kind of bylaws. So sometimes you'll do a lot of work establishing new bylaws, but when it comes up for a vote, you'll hit the lack of understanding in a way that slows the process down. So to be pondering a robust way to bring your community along with why these things are important and how they're going to benefit both them and the community and Western Mass long term.
yes, that's a good point, Meredith. And that the MVP action grants, they put, there's a whole given equal weight to the nature-based solution is a whole section on describing how you will be conducting education and outreach around any project that gets implemented, who you're going to be talking to, how you make sure that you're talking to the people who are least likely to be involved on their own accord or due to barriers, et cetera. And how do you make that engagement equitable? So while it's not always easy to think about, it's not always easy to come up with those ideas right now as we're writing these strategies, the more that you can at least be thinking about it, and we can get any ideas on the paper now, that's good. But as as you go to write those action grants later, or PVP is helping you write a grant or something like that, that's something we will spend a lot of time talking about, and really something that will need to be a major component of any MVP action grant. Okay, so just keeping track of time here, unless there's anything else to add to this, we can scroll a little bit up and take a look at others that we haven't addressed yet. So as a reminder, that's vector-borne diseases, invasive species, any of the water bodies, including wetlands, reservoirs, and rivers, agriculture, open space generally or specifically, and wildlife management areas generally or specifically. Would it be helpful if I read through some of these blue strategies, or can you all read those okay?
I can give you a few insights on the wildlife management areas.
Okay.
Sorry, my daughter was asking me a question. So those are owned by Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. And we would consider them a strength because they do, keep the land intact, especially in some of the upper watershed portions. So it's going to help a little bit with keeping the land as is so that there's no development going off, not as much erosion and whatnot. So it really would help with rainfall and flooding that's coming up, as well as those wetlands and whatnot that are upstream, being able to hold water back in the cases of drought, as well as wildfires. So yeah, that's really all I had for that.
Well, and touching too on the conversation we were just having about how important the forests are, in Chester and Western Mass generally, for wildlife movements and for I think Markel, you were talking about the Williamsburg Open Space Recreation Plan, that map viewer where you can see sort of how how some lands have like more nooks and crannies that make them more resilient because they have different microclimates and things like that. So certainly an asset for all of those reasons. Are there any strategies specific to that that Chester would prioritize, or is it could also just be that we want to identify that they're a strength and we don't have to have any strategies on them?
They have a monitoring system that wildlife does. I know I follow the Mass Wildlife online, so they have where you can upload pictures and stuff of the wildlife. So since we have Abbott Brook, uploading and looking at the brook and the fish that come down from there and the soils and whatnot. It's, you know, since we live here, you know, we always like to walk and hike around on the property, so we can always keep an eye on it. Or we have neighbors up here that we can kind of collect and see if we can't like get together and kind of have like an informed group where we keep monitoring the Abbott Brook.
Yeah, so we so on the fishery side of things, we do fishery surveys on a lot of the water bodies across the state, and after looking through our database, so we do stream surveys throughout the summer every year, and we have a high number that we've done in Chester alone. I threw some numbers together here. So we've done so we've actually done 91 surveys on 19 water bodies in Chester since '97, and that doesn't include what we've done in the last 2 years. We have identified in the town, please stop, 23 CFRs, so cold water fisheries resources. So these are water bodies that tend to be more vulnerable to changes of development, temperature, nutrient content, as well as climate change. So these are ones that we do monitor. The ones that we survey frequently, there's 6 of them. We do monitor annually or every few years to see if there's been any changes, and they're using that as part of some of the studies for how these water bodies are resilient to climate change, and how they're changing. So it's part of a larger project that's going on. So we have a fairly decent idea on the aquatic side of it.
Okay.
Yeah, as for wildlife monitoring, I don't know how they do that, because we don't really look at populations for like smaller game species, but other than you know, like turkey check, deer check is where we get our information for game species and what the harvest is.
If Chester was going to pursue an assessment of Abbott Brook, let's say, and your involvement, and we're developing a concept for sharing information about the value of that brook upstream and downstream,
yes,
would be really a beautiful match to that application, to make it a really meaty action plan.
Yeah, and the fact that it's also a severe barrier on Abbott, it's a cold water fisheries, it's the headwaters to Abbott Brook WMA, you know, all of that stuff can really be good backing for trying to get that culvert replaced and get it redesigned.
That's really, that's great to hear about the aquatic resilience. And, you know, it could be that the resilient lands, the terrestrial side, is kind of a complement to that. And I would think, you know, I'm just thinking about the steep hills surrounding the West Branch of the Westfield, and you know, the local sort of topography is one of the things that was looked at when they were developing the resilience data, because you know, sort of the more variation in elevation, like you were describing, Corinne, with those topography, the micro elevational changes, the higher the resilience, the higher the climate resilience. So that would speak to maybe land acquisition in riparian buffer areas where you're really wanting to maintain that forest cover that provides a lot of the, you know, filtration for and protects the water bodies that are so critical.
Yeah, as well as for flooding issues too, because you're gonna lessen erosion, you're gonna lessen more flashy water events coming down through, just because it is already you know, high gradient system. So if you start losing some of your bank stability, it can get extremely more flashy and have worse flood events that you're already having now.
Yeah, so maybe a combination of, like, you know, I think floodplain restoration also is something that could be considered.
Yeah, and that can also feed into a little bit of flood storage too. So if you're losing those floodplains, there's nowhere for those higher waters to go. So to be able to restore those to create that natural storage.
Moving those floodplain notes into the water bodies rivers
Perfect.
category, because I think it spans more than just wildlife management areas.
Yeah. When I start going, I just tend to start bouncing back to subjects. I'm like,
Well,
oh, what about this one?
It's making me think of in our meeting last week, we talked about how there already is Chester already benefits from a recreation economy, and there's the opportunity to sort of like keep expanding the recreation economy or like build more quote unquote infrastructure, no matter if that's, you know, physical infrastructure or sort of like marketing or something like that, to increase that those dollars coming in and those types of people visiting, et cetera. And the wildlife management areas, I don't know much about the terminology. I think I live right across the street from one, I think, and it has trails all over it, and I'm like always in those trails. So are these necessary? Are these areas where they would welcome like passive recreation, or are some of them like closed off? They don't want any sort of.
So the little bit of background on wildlife management areas. So they are public land, state land that's open for all the public for a few reasons. For one, for us to be able to manage what we have for resources in the state, both flora and fauna, as well as to do management of our game species. So whether it's fish, whether it's deer, that kind of thing. So we allow hunting, fishing, trapping in all of our management areas. We don't prohibit public access, but we do prohibit like ATV use. We don't allow the creation of trails on them unless it's through, you know, an organization like working with Keystone Arches or the Highland Hills trails. But we don't really want to make it a trail system network similar to what DCR does. Just because the land also needs to be open for the hunting, fishing, trapping, as well as just keeping the habitat just as it is. And sometimes trails can be a detriment to the habitat as well as the species. So that's really how they're managed, is trying to keep the land as it is with welcoming some recreation, but as long as it's minimal and it's non-invasive or destructive.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like there's not necessarily a strategy or anything to pursue around that.
Not necessarily, no.
There could be something related to managing the forests on the wildlife management areas to reduce invasives or invasive species and to make them sort of more resilient. So managing for a diversity of species and ages. You know, I think the state already does a lot of that. And I know some of these are classified as different categories. Like I think Hiram Fox is maybe a reserve. So maybe no harvesting. So anyway, they have different categories, I think, each WMA in terms of how the forest is managed.
Yeah, and they have forestry management plans that our wildlife section does out of Westboro. So they are looking at whether they need to do some kind of management plan based on the habitat and the forest that's in there.
So thinking about strategies for Chester, is that something that like the town would participate in or work with DER, DFW on, or is that sort of just like is there a strategy for Chester, I guess, with that?
Based on the WMAs, I don't know for the WMA specifically. I think if the town was looking to do similar types of habitat management on town-owned properties, then absolutely they can talk with our agency and try to get some ideas and some information. And then some collaboration.
I don't want to lose that thought though, Markel, and I'm wondering if maybe we don't put it with the wildlife management areas, but we put it with the open space category for just like ensure forest management, or like conduct outreach to private landowners, you know, to offer resources on like best practices for forest management to encourage a diversity of ages and species or something like that.
Yeah, we did end up including something like that in the Williamsburg MVP plan to talk, you just speak to the fact that so much of the forest land is privately owned. And there's a real interest when we did our public visioning session in private landowners figuring out the best ways to manage their forests, and they felt like they needed more resources.
That would be actually very nice, since me and my husband, my family, we do a book, Abbott Brook. So more information would be extremely helpful. We would like to learn to keep this environment as clean and have that integrity kept as much as we can.
And DFW could be a point for that, for people looking to just get some information on.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
Okay, great. So let's see, we're at 7:40. On my calendar, or agenda, I had at 7:45, we would start to do the prioritizations over here. I don't remember if that actually took 15 minutes or not in our last meeting. I think we were a little bit behind, so it's hard to tell. But so just keeping in mind that we should have a target of moving on in 5 to 10 minutes, let's say. Any other strategies or features that anyone would like to focus on, make sure that they have a say on before we move on?
I think it's worth revisiting. This can be at a later date, but the wetlands and the value under extreme heat, drought, and wildfire, just to call that out as a real benefit.
So Meredith, I think that's a great point. Working with our communities on MVP, I feel like something that comes up a lot in our towns that either have like concentrated centers, but then it gets very rural very quickly, or are just totally rural all around, that coming up with nature-based solutions for environmental problems are often difficult, because it's like it's like, don't plant more trees. Like our whole town is 85 to 90% forest cover, you know, like we don't need any more shade trees necessarily. But I'm wondering, based off of what you just said, if wetlands, I think in particular, are very often vilified because people see them as mosquito breeding grounds. They see them as smelly, you know, or they're just like, what is that wet piece of land? You know, it's like, I can't walk on it, so why do I like it? I don't care about it. And I'm wondering if any of you feel like that's the case in Chester, or not the case overall in Chester, but if you feel like there's pockets of that sort of feeling, like, and I'm not trying to direct your strategies here, but I think that that's one thing that we haven't spoken about yet. Is there wetlands or beyond? Is there any need for sort of like education around why the natural resources are so helpful during times of climate change, maybe?
I think that would be helpful for a lot of people to understand where the wetlands are and what you guys are trying to conserve in those wetlands, and how we can contribute as a community too.
Okay. I don't mean to, is that something everybody agrees with? I don't want to just like have written a strategy myself, but okay, great.
Generally, I think there's a very good understanding of the importance of wetlands.
You think there is a good understanding?
I would say so. In my opinion, there is, yeah.
Mm-hmm. What about in the schools? Does anyone know anything about how the schools might be engaging children about like just about the natural resources or with the natural resources around? Does that happen a lot?
I don't know if in Chester they're participating in this program, but they have an adopted trout program through Mass Wildlife, where some schools across the state are able to get grant funding to grow trout actually in the classroom and then release it. So we've been, I don't know how many schools we've been working with out of our field headquarters, but that definitely could be a possibility for Chester.
I know Gateway has an outdoor club. So that getting students outdoors is critically important.
Uh-huh.
Many years ago, Gateway did have a small program raising fry, but that's probably
Yeah.
30 years ago. I don't know if they have anything now.
Yeah, I think that was for the salmon program. Yep. So the trout program is the relic from that salmon program.
Yes, I think, yeah.
When I was superintendent there 50 years ago almost, we introduced outward bound experiential education, and it was the precursor to expeditionary learning. And I know that they've tried to continue it after I left, and they did for quite a number of years, and it did have a powerful impact on that generation of students. And I know that they've had an outdoor learning program, but I don't know much of the details. It's interesting to note that both the Huntington main campus, if you will, and the Chester Elementary School are both on major branches of the river. And, you know, it's really important that it's right literally at their side door, their front door. And I think that has to be part of it, and involving the parents and families as well, because around the whole subject of outdoor experiential learning and sustainability, now more important than ever. And Chris Martinson, I don't know if he's in on the call tonight or not, but Chris is establishing a family learning center for earth and sustainability at the old Brookside Lodge and at the property that he and Evie have purchased right across the way. And it all borders the West Branch. I mean, it's, you know, it's all built in. So we, I think in Chester can become a laboratory for earth and sustainability, a model for the state, the nation, and the world. I mean, just because of the historic and the natural importance and its location on the Berkshire Plateau, you know, the natural geological formations. I mean, I think it's key, a key place to have this learning take place.
Yeah, and thanks for that, Rich. And just as a quick plug, you know, we're just talking with our landscape designer on the Brookside project today, and you know, developing a very detailed site map of all the current plants that are there, with an eye towards removing invasives and replacing with local species and creating abundance and food forests and all kinds of things like that. You know, our open question, nobody knows what climate change really means. Is it going to be colder or hotter here, wetter or drier? You know, we don't really know. So we're trying to be as resilient as we can in our planning. You know, you have to take a lot of shots when you don't know what the future is going to look like, and hope you got some of them right.
Yep. And we have some people that are rooted in this history, and I've introduced Paul Waite to Chris Martinson, and Paul and his brother Kenny have been here. Their family's been here for generations, and he's got 150 acres that are under preservation, and he's very much concerned. And it's a feeding waterway into the West Branch. I believe it's West Branch, and it's pristine acreage that he's determined to preserve way beyond his lifetime. So, and there are people like that really care about sustainability, and he should be involved at some point.
This is really exciting because I think, you know, when you talk about engagement on these MVP grants, like there's some really great building blocks in all of what you're talking about. Yeah. Corinne, we should probably turn to prioritization.
Right. Thanks, Patty.
Yeah.
So, all right. Yeah, and I'll just remind everybody too that if you want to take a second look at this after the meeting today, you can follow that link. You know, if you have any other ideas, you know, shoot me an email or Meredith an email, and she'll get it to us, and we can make sure it ends up in the matrix. And also during the engagement, the public engagement piece too, there will be some opportunity for like the general public to be providing some input as to how to prioritize the strategies, and like maybe develop, if they feel like there's some strategies that they would have come up with that are not represented here, to create some new input. So that this is not the end all. you know, when we close down tonight on the.
And I would remind everyone on the call that if anyone is interested in being alerted or having the matrix shared, the way to sign up would be to go to the town website and sign up through that link that's right, the top red button on the right, to allow us to share information as it's gathered and the matrix as it's developed. And then they'll also receive a draft of the MVP plan. But the best way and most easy way is for them to go there and sign up, and they can still do that.
Great, Meredith, that's a good point. Thank you. Sorry, I keep moving my screen around. I keep forgetting that you can see it, and I'm trying to make it so I can see everything I need to see while Zoom is taking up so much space. But hopefully it's the last time that I move it. So I think that tonight we can, so last week we did it with the polls, and I hope that tonight, or I thought tonight we could try doing it without the polls, where we just sort of like do a general discussion. The discussion can't be too long, but maybe we can just say like, oh, I heard the most amount of people saying short term and medium priority or something. And again, because there's so many strategies that can be associated with one feature, I think it makes sense to prioritize the feature rather than individual strategies, because otherwise we would be here for hours more. So at this point, I am going to have to reduce the size just so I can see everything. Sorry, and I'll read to you. But okay. So again, we're prioritizing on timeline, where the options are short-term, medium, and long, or short-term, long-term, and ongoing. Those don't have set definitions. They're just however you think about it. Short-term might be the next 1 to 3 years. Long-term might be 5 years or more. And then ongoing means we're either already working on it, we're going to continue working on it, or it might be in like, once this is a really long-term thing, once we start, you know, it's not a project that just ends, it's going to keep going. So, and then the priority is high, medium, or low, and those are pretty self-explanatory. They're just in relationship to each other. It's not, there's no set hierarchy there. So it's just how there's no limit to the number of high priorities you can have, for example. So the first one here is the wildlife management areas. Our strategy was ensure a strong understanding of value of these lands for wildlife habitat, etc. So for timeline, short, long, or ongoing?
Ongoing.
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 Great. We're all in agreement. Okay, and then high, medium, or low?
Medium.
Medium.
Yeah, medium.
Medium.
Okay. People can feel free to disagree too. And then we can have a discussion. Okay, great. So then open space, which had 3 separate actions there, CPA, adopt the CPA, organize educational programs for forest landowners on the benefits of conserving, and work with private landowners to ensure they know about existing resource for forage management best practices. So those are a little bit overlapping there. So for that feature, short, long, or ongoing?
Ongoing.
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 Right, and then high, medium, or low?
Medium.
Medium.
Great. Okay, we did not come up with any strategies for agriculture this time, so I'm going to skip past it. Wetlands and vernal pools. The strategies there were to create a pamphlet on the significance of vernal pools and the certifying process. I think that came out of conversations that Meredith had. Meredith, correct me if I'm wrong. And then tonight we came up with consider developing an educational program for residents to highlight the benefits of Chester's natural resources. So that kind of goes across a lot of these. Short, long, or ongoing?
Short to get it going, I guess. Huh?
Ongoing.
Ongoing. Ongoing.
Okay, and it is also, as you probably remember from last time, we can do hybrid approaches there. So I'll do short and ongoing because I understand Dave's point too, where it's like education doesn't end, you know, those resources will be available.
Started quick is what I was thinking.
Okay.
I wanted to add that I did hear in the conversations that protecting some of the agricultural lands was an important thing to be considered.
Protecting via APR.
I'm not sure. I just heard that that came up as a important element in Chester, was to identify and protect farmland.
I do have a old farm that's abutting my property as well, and it's a very old farm, and I would love to see it restored. So I'm just can only speak from my opinion. So I'm just thinking that might also be helpful for other people that come in and they see that the land is all rocks and everything. So they have other farmland restoring.
I'm gonna, Meredith,
Yeah,
I'm gonna,
that should be an ongoing priority.
okay. So I'm just sort of, for prioritizing protection, I sort of broke that down into two pieces, Meredith, neither of which you said specifically, but it covers both aspects that I think of when I think of farmland protection. So if anybody's not okay with this, let me know. But I said work with landowners / farm, that should say farmers, to enlist their lands with the APR program. If anyone's not aware, that's where you work with the Mass Department of Agricultural Resources, and they work with the state to pay the difference between the development value of the land versus the agricultural value of the land. So that way the landowners can still realize the equity that they need to get out of their lands in order to retire or, et cetera. But then the farmland is preserved forever for agricultural uses only. And then the second aspect here was to map agricultural soils to know where they are for prioritizing for protection. And that's something you can do with, any of the state online mappers and things like that, and just make sure that that resource is available.
So Corinne, we have 6 more minutes.
Okay, thanks. So do we say this was short, or I forget what we said for timeline?
I say short.
Okay. And then priority, did somebody say a priority?
Medium.
Okay, great.
Yep.
All right, and we didn't do, it looks like we did not do a priority for the vernal pools. Maybe I just didn't write it down. Was that medium?
Medium.
Okay.
Medium.
Yeah.
Okay, did not come up with anything for the reservoirs, but that's okay because we did that in our last one. So the rivers, we have conduct a multi-town watershed-wide assessment of flood storage capacity to reduce flood damage along the west branch of the Westfield River. That seems important and related to what we've been speaking about. And then look into floodplain restoration where it's needed and where might it make sense. And then I also took notes on the conversation around the schools. So continue to engage with schools and the public, celebrate the uniqueness of the geology of town, etc. Short, long, or ongoing?
Ongoing.
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 All right, and then priority, high, medium, or low?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, great.
Aye.
Aye.
Hello.
Hi.
Aye.
Okay, so then invasive species. Work with DEM/DCR and other agencies to inventory potential invasive plants in town, initiate a local volunteer program, including students, to implement potential control measures.
Ongoing.
Ongoing.
All right.
Ongoing.
Ongoing.
The priority level? High, medium, low?
Medium.
Oh, aye.
Medium, yeah.
Aye.
Okay,
Medium
I think
0.5.
Okay, I'm gonna do H/M because I think I heard equal amounts there. We didn't come up with anything for vector-borne diseases. Okay, so then impacts of development, such as from, we talked about this, residential, commercial, and infrastructural, so, cell towers, etc. This is the whole regulatory review. I'll avoid reading this whole thing to you. But it's essentially a regulatory review to look at zoning, site plan approval, special permit, subdivision regulations, et cetera, to ensure that natural resources are protected and that development happens responsibly, and that items like the solar arrays, et cetera, are designed to also have beneficial ecological components.
Can I just say something, that there's only strength in that area, and I see it as a vulnerability if it's not addressed because of climate migration, which all of the hill towns are experiencing.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point, Meredith. I would not have, I don't know how that just ended up there.
Could somebody repeat what was just said? I didn't hear it, and I picked up a little bit of it.
I was just pointing out that on the matrix, it was only identified as a strength, and I see it as a vulnerability for the hill towns that are vulnerable to what is being called climate migration, where land and areas are being purchased, sometimes sight unseen, in an attempt to get out of more urban areas. So without the protections that some bylaw review would afford you, you may end up with build outs that compromise your habitat and the things that you find valuable.
Yes, very well taken.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good point, Meredith, where climate migration, I personally think, is an important thing to talk about, most specifically within the societal and community workshop, which will be this Saturday. But so I amended that. Okay, and so now we're at 7:59, so we only have 2 more to go. Do we think this one's short, long, or ongoing?
Ongoing.
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 Ongoing, high priority.
Hi. Do other people?
Hi.
Okay.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Okay, and then the last one we have here is the wind, hydro, and solar power renewables, this time in the context of a feasibility study for Chester Municipal Electric Light Company to really invest in a lot of, conduct a feasibility study to determine what renewables are worth investing in, and then how to go about that for many benefits for the town. So
short and high.
Short and high for me too.
Short and high.
Very high.
Very high. The H.
Okay.
Okay.
You had too much cake.
Well, great job, everybody, because we're at, I guess it just turned 8:01, but we were almost right on time. So I'm going to stop share of this. I'm not going to reshare the last slide that we had for the presentation. I think just says, I'm just going to double check, but I think it just says the next steps. Our next webinar is this Saturday. You will have a reminder email from me about that, but I believe it's 9 from 12, or from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m.
I don't think I can do that.
It's a little longer, but I think that there's some extra time built in there that maybe we don't, we might get out early. We also have been having some good conversation, and we've been going right to time, for these last 2 meetings. So please hold aside the 3 hours. Meredith? Yeah.
I just wanted to mention, because we haven't had any success bringing in a teen or a family with young children, if anyone has someone that they would like to invite, please encourage them. It would be lovely to capture that perspective and voice. I also have worked really hard to try and get someone from the school to attend and have not had success, but perhaps as community members, I don't want to say pressure, it's more active encouragement might result in them participating, because there could be some really interesting outreach that they could benefit from and also get funding to realize. And I'd love to have them on board for that.
I think Laura meets that criteria. And I just want to point out, Dave does not wake up until noon.
Saturday is prime museum season. So
I'll be bringing my kids down. Don't worry. We'll have a ball.
If this were an in-person workshop, we would make sure to have egg sandwiches and hot coffee for you all, but unfortunately, you'll just have to imagine those or make them yourself for this Saturday. So in the meantime, hopefully see you all then. In the meantime, be thinking about any societal features that you are familiar with in Chester that you'll want to talk about. Patty, did you have anything to say or to add before we close out?
I don't. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Participation was great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, I had one more thing, and what didn't come up was the fact that Chester does have a number of trails, and that the Highlands Footpath is working very hard on that. So when you asked about fish and wildlife lands, we sort of ended the conversation before addressing that both the Nature Conservancy and the Highlands Footpath and the Archbridge Trail and the value of those things, you might want to tuck those into, they're both societal, but they're also of environmental import because they're large tracts of land that are kept wild for that purpose.
Right.
Awesome. Thank you.
And yeah, we can talk further about that because I think there's value in terms of people understanding. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Great. Thanks so much, everybody. See you Saturday.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
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 Everybody.